Dangerous Assassin, Book 1. Written by Elizabeth Wheatley. Narrated by Elizabeth Wheatley.
Chapter 1. The Assassin. Amira couldn't disobey her father even if she tried, and every god in the lower heavens knew she had tried. Bonra kneaded the hem of her nightgown in her hands. "Do you have to go?" she fretted, though she knew the answer.
"Maybe I could speak to Papa in the morning. I need you to help me with the arrangements for the betrothal celebrations. And then there's the wedding."
"No use," Amira said, her words flat and unsympathetic. Their father had ordered her out tonight. She couldn't refuse. No one was supposed to know what Amira did on their father's errands, but Bonra knew. They never discussed it, never spoke of Amira's midnight escapades, but something passed between them, unspoken, unknown, and at the same time undeniable. Amira finished lacing her boot beside the single glazed window. The two sisters were in Amira's room, the bedchamber meant for a lady's maid that adjoined Fonra's suite. It was far better than some of the hovels where Amira had spent her nights during her occasional travels. Yet it was nothing compared to the gilt accents and lacquer motifs Fonra had on her side of the door. In her gray dressing gown, with the candle casting shadows on her face, Fonra seemed more ghost than girl. "Please, Amira," Fonra whispered, voice shaking for the first time. "I can't do this without you. I can't." "Hush," Amira snapped, pulling the cowl of her cloak to cover her head. "You'll be fine." "But do you expect me to hold your hand through every moment?" Amira's words turned sharp, toxic. She had nothing but poison and daggers in her tongue tonight. "Follow you down the aisle? To your bridal suite?" Fonra flushed. "If I tell Papa I need you, he'll—" Amira cut her off. "He'll ignore you and tell you to focus on your wedding." Even if the wedding wouldn't happen, not if Amira succeeded in killing the bridegroom tonight. "Now go back to bed, Fonra, before your maids notice you're gone." Fonra was quiet for a moment. "When will you be back?" Amira replied with a string of words she'd learned from a mule driver in Calethian. Fonra spun around so fast the candle's glass case wobbled and she had to steady it with her hand. In a flurry of silk, Fonra disappeared back through the door and to her side of the apartment. When she was sure her sister was gone, Amira checked her bandolier and the blades strapped across her chest and over one hip. Too many weapons would slow her down, and there was rarely time or need to draw more than one, but their weight was comforting against her chest. Amira opened her window and hesitated as she placed one boot on the sill. "You are to protect your sister with your life," was one of the earlier commands her father had given her all those years ago. She couldn't protect Fonra from where she was going, could she? No. She needed to stay here, and a subtle tightness in her throat warned her that the curse was having none of it. Amira gritted her jaw and stepped up to the edge of the sill with both feet. She gripped the trellis to the left side of her window and swung to the outside of the wall. Almost immediately, the tightness vanished. So long as she obeyed her father, the curse was her friend. It made her stronger, faster, and more powerful, but only if she served well. Unfortunately, Amira's tendency to hunt for loopholes and gaps in her father's commands meant that the curse had done little for her in the decade and a half that she'd been subject to it. Amira checked the surroundings below before dropping into the grass beneath her window. The private garden of their family's city estate was nothing compared to the herb gardens of Count Phelan in the south, or the fabled game park of the Aramaean palace, but it still took Amira several minutes to make her way out. Most of the servants had been dismissed for the night, and those who were out at this hour usually didn't want to be seen any more than she did. In the stables, she found Penrad, her father's steward. He waited atop his dappled grey gelding. His dark green riding habit reminded Amira of pond scum by the light of the lone lantern. "There ye are," he snapped, the moment Amira came into view. Here in the palace, he liked to pretend she was a page or squire. She kept her head down, avoiding the gaze of a yawning groomsman. She took the reins of a second horse beside Penrad's and swung aboard the mare without a word. Penrad tilted his head to the side. "What? No apology for being late? Lazy, worthless, good-for-nothing sack of—" The dark and her hood shadowed her face, but her voice would give her away to the servants. And her father had commanded her not to tell anyone who she was. What she was. Amira couldn't make so much as a squeak in her own defense. That didn't stop her leveling a glare at the steward. If she ever got free of this curse. "His lordship should have you whipped for your insolence," Penrad added. Amira jabbed her heels into her horse's sides. The animal bolted for the gate toward the city. Steering the animal around a tight corner, she rode out under the low arch that separated the Heil Palace from the rest of Lashera, their capital. Penrad stopped cursing once they made it to the main roads. Amira slowed her horse to a trot to avoid attention, and Penrad slowed his animal to a trot beside her. The city was drowsy, but a place like this was rarely ever fully asleep. Even in the dead of winter, when snowstorms blanketed every eave and cobble in ice, a few intrepid Lasherans could still be seen scuttling through the streets. Penrad let her lead the way to the side gate of the city, the one reserved for messengers and those on official business from the Heil family. 4 guards outside, another 10 inside the guardhouse. Without looking up, Amira could see the caw wafting from them with every exhale. There was something small and alive in there with them, perhaps a cat or a rodent, but it was too small to be a dog. Some scholars believed that caw was magic. Others claimed it was raw life force that bound magic. Whatever it was, it came from living things, and only those who could channel it could detect it. Amira could sense caw on a spectrum somewhere between sight and touch. It had always been warm and golden to her, ribbons of Aurelian energy. Penrad flashed the bracelet around his wrist, and the guards let them pass. In a fiefdom as large as Highlandale, there was always some urgent errand or message that needed to be couriered from the capital. Amira let the steward lead the way out the gates, down the narrow courier's road toward the pine forests that cloaked the hills. Forests were always heavy with caw, just thick enough to be distracting, but rarely strong enough to be useful. They rode on in silence for a good 10 miles. The horses' hooves squelched in a thick layer of mud, mingling with the hundreds of tracks already on the road. They left the main road and ventured another 6 miles into the dark before they stopped. Amira dismounted, pulling a single satchel from her horse before passing the reins to the steward. "You know what to do," Penrad said. In the dark, Amira couldn't quite read his face, but his voice trembled slightly. Gone was the bravado and derision from the stables. They were out here to commit high treason. Amira gulped, forcing herself to breathe evenly. "I'm not powerful enough," she said. "The king overestimates me." Penrad jerked his chin toward the woods. "Get on with it." It was no use. Even if she could convince Penrad of the truth, only her liege lord could rescind his own order, and that was her father. As a child, swearing to obey and serve her father had seemed such an innocent thing, a right thing. If only she'd known the truth then. Marching alone into the woods, Amira slung her satchel over her shoulders. There was food and water for 1 day, along with the strings, hooks, and nails needed to make snares. Her father wasn't intentionally trying to get her killed. That much she believed. He'd invested and profited too much from her to throw her away needlessly. So he was either arrogant or desperate. It was always hard to tell with him. If he was ordering her to strike against the Empire's heir, it must be desperation. Amira had been young, but she remembered enough of the conquest to remember the smell of the Empire's wrath, burning flesh and smoking pitch. What she was about to do would be enough to bring all of that and more crashing down on all of Highlandale. She stopped to rest a few times before continuing her trek. Her father's scouts had confirmed the caravan was only a day or so away. On foot, she could cut through the forests and catch them well before they reached Lashera. These imperial soldiers rarely moved with haste in peacetime, nor did they move with stealth. It wasn't hard to find them, and she did it in a matter of hours. Amira prowled the edge of the camp, hidden in the shadow of trees. They'd stopped in a clearing off the main road, pitching their tents in a neat grid. No one else had been spotted traveling into the fief, and this many people together wouldn't have been able to hide from King Hyle's scouts. It could only be the archduke's personal convoy. Some 200 guards, if she had to guess, not to mention the cooks, potboys, porters, footmen, laundresses, hawk-keepers, dog-boys, scribes, and everything else that traveled with an imperial caravan. She guessed there must be some 500 people all told. 500 people, and she was supposed to find one? Amira pushed aside the impossibility of her task. Yesterday, she had burned candles to Eponine, the goddess of sorceresses. Seeking the goddess's favor produced mixed results in her experience, but Amira had been desperate enough to give it another try. Kneeling a few hundred paces off, Amira chewed her lip, studying the camp. She needed to get to the center of the circle of tents. That was where her mark would most likely be. She climbed a tree and hung her satchel among the topmost branches. It was unlikely she would be able to retrieve it, even if she survived, but she liked to hope for the best. Slinking down to the ground, Amira took her time, lingering until the tightness in her throat returned and her curse threatened to strangle her if she didn't stop stalling. The curse had endless patience for planning. Once, she had spent 3 weeks stalking a mark, and it had never prodded her. Yet it always seemed to know when she was stalling for time and punished her accordingly. Once she was on the ground, Amira picked up the pace in the direction of the imperial camp. She inhaled the crisp night air, steadying herself before she moved on. Tonight, she would kill an archduke and end a dynasty. Reaching the outskirts of the camp, she found guards stationed about 100 paces from where the tents began. Circling carefully, she hesitated, studying the camp. There was nothing unusual about it as far as a nobleman's caravan. Fairly straightforward. Amira would have expected more guards on duty for an archduke, but she supposed His Imperial Highness didn't expect much resistance in Highlandale. Her father's kingdom had never been one for resistance. Amira walked back into the trees. She cocked her head to the side, half listening and half searching for the faint wisps of caw that flowed from all living things. The pines around her created a soft haze that made it like wading through fog, but she only had to search a few hundred paces before a soft pulse of caw caught her attention. Sliding one of her knives from her bandolier, she squinted, measuring the distance to be sure she had a straight shot. With one flick of her wrist, there was a squeak and a faint shuffling. The rabbit kicked and thrashed, with her knife pinning it to the tree at its back. Amira swept in and yanked the knife free, slitting its throat while its claws scratched at her armored forearms. She grimaced, holding the animal away from her as it kept kicking. Blood, thick with caw, flowed over her hands. Gripping the dying rabbit by the scruff of its neck, she poured the blood over the runes etched in her bracers, her breastplate. Lastly, she painted 2 stripes down her cheeks and smeared 3 vertical lines across her forehead. She focused, turning her mind inward. Amira pulled her own caw from within her chest, where her life force pooled around her heart. Caw accumulated in the skull as well, but the heart was easier to channel out the hands. Amira waited until the blood stopped dripping, tracing over her runes again and again, even after she could feel them burning with Ka. Amira laid the rabbit's limp body on the ground. She was glad it was dark so she couldn't see it. She took a moment to steady herself, pushing away fear, anxiety, dread, and all her other useless emotions. She couldn't turn back. Her curse wouldn't allow it. Returning to the edge of the clearing, Amira crouched low and made her way toward the camp. The nearest guards stirred as she came closer. The grass rippled around her, but to them it would appear as just a disturbance from the wind. 2 of them at stations 50 paces apart glanced in her direction. Amira froze. This spell didn't make her invisible, only unnoticeable. It was a simple bit of magic, one of the few pieces she'd managed to teach herself. When she used this spell, most people blinked and looked away. These men were no different. The guards' eyes passed over her and around her, but never landed. Amira stayed low to the ground, waiting until they went back to watching the woods. Guard duty was the dullest task imaginable, especially when one was in a vassal fiefdom in peacetime. Highlandale had its brigands and robbers like anywhere else, but few were brazen enough to attack an armed caravan. Even fewer were brazen enough to come this close to Lashera. Amira had been sent to practice on outlaws as a child. She'd brought back at least a dozen heads to her father to be staked on the city gates. Rumors had spread that King Hyle's sheriff must be dabbling in sorcery. Criminals had begun fleeing the fief, yet their heads had still found their way to the city gates just the same. Amira had moved on to bigger tasks now, but the rumors remained strong. No one meddled with the lawmen of Highlandale. A mastiff, tethered outside one of the tents, let off a chuffing growl. The dog stood, tail erect and ears perked. It half whined, half barked in her direction, blinking in confusion. Amira slunk away from the dog. Animals were often more resistant to dread sight spells. Perhaps the dog could scent the rabbit's blood. Slipping deeper into the camp, Amira walked quietly, not drawing attention to herself. To those who saw her, she would be a nondescript shadow, a faceless figure moving past in the firelight. 4 soldiers gathered around a dice table stopped laughing, hunkering a little closer to the swords that lay at their sides. She slipped past them, and they never even looked up. Amira crossed paths with a middle-aged woman in a linen dress, fur cloak about her shoulders, probably an officer's wife. The woman frowned and glanced in Amira's direction, but her eyes never quite landed on the assassin, sliding over and around just like the guards had. The woman pulled her cloak tighter about her and retreated in the opposite direction. Amira continued on. The archduke's tent wasn't difficult to find. It was predictably at the center, with the full banner of the imperial stag, a white raven perched in its antlers. She angled toward the tent, then stopped a few paces off. The tent had no guards, but that wasn't surprising. Outside the entrance slumped a page, and what she guessed was a footman in their respective sleeping rolls beside a dying cook fire. Squinting, she noted the light of a lamp from inside. Was the archduke still awake? She grimaced. If he was awake, would he be alone? If he was drinking with a companion or attended by a courtesan, that would make her task much more difficult. He might be betrothed to her sister, but fidelity was not a prized virtue among men of the nobility. Either way, the tent was secured to the ground with massive iron stakes, and cutting her way through the canvas would draw too much attention. Amira checked to make sure there were no dogs nearby and edged toward the tent. So long as she was quiet and didn't do anything to draw attention to herself, the dread sight spell allowed her to do as she pleased. She slipped inside and paused beside the tent entrance, surveying the lone figure crouched over a folding desk. The single lamp silhouetted a man with a slim fencer's build, his sandy blonde head bowed over parchment. The cot in the corner was unmade and empty. Slipping through the entrance, Amira circled to the far end of the tent, opposite the figure before her. The only sound was the scratch of the stranger's quill. He paused, studied the page, scratched something out, and dipped his quill in ink again. The assassin peered over his shoulder, confirming the imperial seal stamped at the top of the parchment. By law, only members of the imperial household and those acting with their authority could use the seal. This had to be Daedrith Fandulian, Archduke of Aramea, son of Empress Vesha and the late Emperor Tristan, and heir to the Aramean Empire. A few of the words under the figure's quill caught Amira's eye, short sentences breaking off down the page. Words had been scratched out and rewritten at least a dozen times over, but there appeared to be a final draft at the lower right corner. Cut me and I bleed poison. Wound me to your own pain. These bruises have crushed giants. This nightmare maddens the sane. The young man kept writing, crossing out words then rewriting, oblivious to her presence. Amira recalled hearing from Fonra, when Fonra had still been besotted with the idea of him, that the Archduke was said to be quite the accomplished poet. Accomplished was not the word Amira would have used. Those words made something shudder along her spine. It was like hearing footsteps when she was supposed to be alone. Amira could feel the curse tightening about her throat, a warning. If she put it off much longer, she'd be on the floor gasping. She drew the short blade from her hip, using her opposite hand to steady the sheath. Nausea worked its way up the back of her throat. She'd never quite gotten a taste for killing. Most of the people her father sent her after weren't bad people. At least, Amira thought they were no worse than her, or her father. Then again, both King Hyle and Amira's deaths would likely make the world a better place. She closed the distance between herself and the Archduke. A single jab to the base of his skull and it would be over. Amira coiled to strike. The Archduke spun around and locked eyes on her. Amira jerked back and almost screamed. Red eyes burned like coals with thin black slits. For one instant she could have sworn wisps of flame licked at his eyelashes. His caw changed. It blustered and smoked like a furnace, hot, ashy, and putrid. Caw didn't change, and yet... He snarled and grabbed her wrist with the knife. Amira aimed her knee for his face and he twisted out of his chair, dropping into a crouch. He grabbed her opposite ankle and yanked. In a flash, he tackled her to the carpet. His fist smashed into her ribs. Janir grunted from the impact and stars flashed across her vision. The Archduke snapped his jaw at her, eyes burning crimson. He curled his lip like he was used to a different mouth, one with sharper teeth. Amira snatched a knife from her belt with her left hand and slashed across his face. He brought his arm up and blocked. Her knife left a bloody gash in his sleeve. He pinned her right arm to the floor. Amira curled in on herself, wedging her knees and shins between them. She bucked, trying to throw him off. She kicked a coat rack and it fell in a clatter. "My lord?" came a voice from outside. "Shit." Amira dropped her knife and grabbed the back of the Archduke's loose shirt. With a deft motion, she twisted it up and to the side, tightening the collar around his throat. The Archduke snarled again, spitting as he did. Amira yanked him to the side and managed to flip him off her. She kicked his ribs the moment she got clear, yanking her knife hand free as she did. The Archduke sprang back to his feet, eyes glowing like molten steel. Outside, his servants had roused, but he didn't call for them. He just stood there, studying her. Amira drew a third knife. If the servants came, they would call the guards and she would be dead. But she had to at least kill him first. She had to. It made sense now. Her father must have known. This thing couldn't reach Lashera, no matter what happened. Fonra couldn't marry this creature. It couldn't live. The Archduke lunged. One instant he was 3 steps away, and the next he was slamming her into the center brace of the tent. The whole tent shook, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. She'd never been caught before. A caught assassin was a dead assassin. Dead, dead, dead. That word echoed through her skull. The archduke, or whatever the creature was that kept her pinned against the brace, studied her like one might study a slice of roasted swan seasoned with an unfamiliar spice. "Who are you?" His voice was like an avalanche of stones and the roar of a bonfire at once. "Have the Istavari witches gone back on their bargain?" A shadow darkened the doorway of the tent, the shape of a young boy, probably a page. Amira twisted sideways for leverage and kicked the archduke in the hip to knock him back. She'd sent men sprawling from that kick before, but he only stumbled a couple of steps. Amira brought up her knife, and the archduke lunged to attack again. He ducked when the knife came up, but she sliced it across her own hand. She could only hope she would bleed enough. She slammed her bloody palm into the archduke's face. He must have been expecting an attack from the knife in her other hand. He didn't block in time, and her bloody hand made contact. She forced Caw down her arm and into the blood. Even when he stumbled back and broke their contact, the blood was hers, so she didn't need to be touching him to make it work. Her bloody handprint glowed copper. The archduke fell to the ground with a scream, and the stench of burning flesh filled the tent.
"Your Highness!"
cried the boy in the doorway. The page rushed to the screaming archduke, and 3 shadows moved outside the tent. Guards. Cursing, Amira raced for the back of the tent. Her boot caught on one of the carpets. She hit the ground with a thud, muffled by the archduke's screaming. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and her head spun. Idiot! Idiot! She'd panicked and poured too much of her own Caw into that spell. The amount of power now burning the archduke's face was enough to cast a dreadsight spell 50 times over. No, no, no.
"Your Highness? Is it another episode? Are you all right?"
The archduke's cry in response was more of a roar, primal and enraged. Outside, horses whinnied and dogs barked. Something in Amira curdled and shrank at the sound of it. Attendants flocked around the archduke. The guards hovered at the entrance. "What's happening?" they demanded. Amira laid on the floor, heart pounding. "They can't see me. They aren't expecting to see me." It seemed the dreadsight spell was still in place. But if it was, how had the archduke, or whatever that creature was, been able to see her? "Fetch Sir Thadrid," said one of the servants, "and Talon."
"Dane? Dane?" a male voice shouted from outside. "Dane, are you all right? Is he angry?"
These people acted wrong. Their archduke was rolling on the floor with fire spreading over his face, and no one was searching the tent. No one seemed to expect a threat. A young man with a dark tousle of hair and a half-buttoned shirt shoved past the guards. He turned heavily on a blackthorn cane, his stride punctuated by a limp. The newcomer caught the archduke's flailing arm only to catch an elbow in the face. He stumbled back with a curse, rubbing his jaw.
"Dangerous?"
No one seemed more than slightly concerned. It was like they stood back while Dangerous flailed, looking to one another and to the darker young man, Sir Thadrid. "What should we do, my lord?" asked the page.
"This is new,"
Thadrid said, shifting his grip on his cane.
"He hasn't had an episode like this before."
Amira blinked at Thadrid from her prone position on the floor. What did the man mean by that? Amira pushed herself onto her elbows, shaking. The entrance to the tent was flooded with servants and retainers. She could cut her way out the back, but someone would notice if she started tearing canvas, and she couldn't risk breaking the spell. Thankfully for now, the archduke's writhing kept their attention. The archduke shuddered and curled into a ball on the floor. He trembled, and slowly his Caw changed again. It turned lighter, more golden. More like the Caw of the others in the tent. Amira swallowed. Nothing about this was natural.
"Dane?"
Thadrid knelt beside the archduke.
"Can you hear me?"
The paler young man panted, hands clutching his face. I'm not. Dangerous' voice was different, lighter, not reverberating so much. Everything about this was wrong. She needed to escape. Vonra was betrothed to a monster, and no matter what happened or the cost, Highlandale needed to break off the engagement. The command that she protect her sister with her life rang in her ears. If she couldn't kill the archduke, she had to save Vonra. Her sister couldn't marry this. If he wasn't a man, what was he? Dangerous looked up, and Amira would have jumped back if she'd been standing. Dangerous' face didn't have a mark on it. He should have had a splattered burn mark, but no. She still smelled his burning flesh. She hadn't imagined that, had she? The girl, Dangerous panted in a distinctly human voice, a rich, almost melodic voice. Where did she go? Thadrid smirked. So that was you dreaming of a girl, was it? Why didn't he seem concerned? Even the servants had begun to back out of the tent. The guards were no longer at the entrance. Never had she been so alarmed by a lack of alarm. Something instinctive and primal within her told her to run, to flee, to get as far away from the archduke and his servants as possible. No. She was here. Dangerous spun around, and his gaze slid over Amira. She stayed still and didn't draw attention to herself. It seemed the dread sight spell was working again. The archduke's eyes were dark now, no longer burning with hellfire. Thadrid frowned, keeping a breadth of space between himself and the archduke, like he expected the other man might go back to flailing at any second. Amira pushed up onto her hands and knees. Sweat dripped into her eyes. She hadn't drained herself like that in years, but in the moment, she'd panicked. Carefully, she backed toward the edge of the tent. If she could hide in a corner, she might be able to wait until the archduke went to bed or left. There. Dangerous leapt off the ground and dove for her, grabbing her wrist. Instantly, Amira felt the dread sight spell burst like a soap bubble. Thadrid jumped with a curse. To him, it would have appeared as if a girl with blood smears on her face popped into existence. Who are you? Dangerous demanded. How did you do that? Amira twisted her wrist inward, snapping out of his grip. She moved a little slow, but still managed to yank herself free. She reached for another knife at her thigh and slashed for Dangerous's chest. He leaned back. Her blade ripped through linen, but she didn't see blood. Dane! Guards! Thadrid shouted. He staggered back, leaning heavily on his cane. The archduke reached for her again, and Amira's blade slashed across the back of his forearm a second time, and he hissed in pain, red dripping from his cut sleeve. My lord! Guards flooded the tent this time. They closed the distance between the entrance and Amira in a heartbeat, or perhaps she was slow from losing so much ka. The first spear jabbed for her side, and she stumbled back. No, I want her alive, the archduke shouted. Amira had no intentions of being taken alive. She flicked her wrist, and a knife plunked into the shoulder of the nearest guard. He flinched, but didn't fall back. Amira retreated, only to hit taut canvas. She dodged the second strike, diving for the tent entrance. The servants scattered, and Thadrid dragged back the archduke while the guards swarmed after her. Amira dodged the first two strikes, but a third spear thrust, and she wasn't fast enough. Her body jerked, and she heard her armor tear, but it wasn't until she stumbled past the fire that she realized blood soaked her side and hip. Shouts and screams rose over the camp as the alarm was raised. Amira ducked and stumbled to the picket lines where she had seen the horses. Survive. That was one of her father's earlier commands. She kept it at the forefront of her mind, burning and echoing through her skull in case the curse decided she was being disobedient. The horse boys scrambled out of their blankets, barefoot in nothing but their trousers, rushing to secure the horses. In the dark, Amira stumbled to the center of the picket line, beating the boys there. She passed over several pack mules and docile-looking cart horses. A large head yanked up and whinnied, jerking back on its lead rope. The head belonged to a destrier, perhaps 17 hands high or more. The towering horse's halter lashed him between two whickering mules. The animals stomped anxiously but didn't bray. Amira snatched a bridle from the rows of tack and ducked under the picket line. The stallion's nostrils flared at the scent of blood, but he was a warhorse. He should be trained to tolerate it. The horse snorted and stomped. Either in fear or excitement, she couldn't tell. Even the mules shied from the scent of her blood, while the horse boys came running to move up and down the line, trying to quiet the animals. "Hey!" One of them spotted Amira. She finished pulling the bridle over the destrier's ears and buckling the throat latch. She took a fistful of the big horse's mane and swung aboard. Her side twinged. In the dark, it was hard to know the extent of her injury, but some distant part of her mind could tell that it was bad. Very bad. Amira turned the destrier's head in the direction of the trees and slammed her heels into his sides. The stallion bolted, and she clung to his mane to stay on. The big horse charged toward the dark lines of trees, hooves eating up the distance in heartbeats. At their backs, soldiers called out. Arrows whipped past, striking the trees and the dirt around them. Amira doubled over the horse's neck, every stride sending a jolt of pain to her ribs. The destrier stumbled in the dark, and Amira slammed forward onto his neck with enough force to drive the wind out of her, but she held on, gasping, as he skittered sideways to regain his footing. Doubled over with her cheek pressed to his black mane, she angled him toward the North Star and pulled on the reins. The destrier snorted, slowing into a canter. After a few miles, she eased the destrier to a walk. It was unlikely the Imperials would chase her in the dark. There was too much risk of an ambush for them. Amira squinted upwards, making out the faint light of stars between the trees. Once she could make an educated guess of the right direction, she turned her stolen horse toward Lashara.